These boats were built for one thing: having a good time. We're talking gentle cruises, family fishing trips, and ducking out of work on a Friday. They were the floating equivalent of a cul-de-sac, reflecting peaceful summer skies. These boats had one job, and that job was to be aggressively, almost offensively, pleasant. But in May of 1940, the vibe shifted, dramatically. For the civilian crews of hundreds of these little ships, their weekend pleasure crafts were about to sail them straight into the final boss of naval warfare. And they'd forgotten to bring their cheat codes. This is the Dunkirk story your history teacher skipped. It's the story of the absolute terror that awaited a bunch of regular guys who answered an insane call for help and ended up in a real-life action movie with no script, no stunt doubles, and terrible catering. Section 1. The Trap. In spring 1940, the so-called phony war suddenly got brutally, pants-wettingly real. Germany's blitzkrieg didn't just hit the gas pedal, it ripped it out and threw it at France's face. Allied commanders, expecting a slow, boring World War I-style staring contest, could not have been more wrong. The German tanks treated the Allies' big, expensive fortress like it was a traffic cone and floored it straight for the English Channel. By May 21st, boom, the trap snapped shut. The entire British Army, plus hundreds of thousands of French and Belgian soldiers, almost 400,000 men, were suddenly stuck on a beach with their backs to the ocean. It was like a giant cosmic prank, only the punchline was getting wiped out. Their last hope was the city of Dunkirk, but the Germans were busy turning it into the world's largest pile of rubble. This was, without a doubt, the worst beach trip in history. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, on basically his first week on the job, was staring down the biggest military disaster in history. Losing Britain's entire professional army would be like a football team losing its starting lineup, the coaching staff, and the water boy right before the Super Bowl. Germany could just waltz across the channel and start measuring Buckingham Palace for new curtains. At first, they hoped to save maybe 45,000 men. Everyone else was considered toast. This wasn't just a bad situation. It was a full-blown, we're definitely going to need a bigger boat apocalypse. Section 2. The Unlikely Answer. The problem was, to put it mildly, an absolute unit. The main harbor at Dunkirk was a smoldering wreck, filled with sunken ships and bad vibes. You couldn't get a big warship in there if you tried. And the beaches, a logistical nightmare seemingly designed by Satan himself to be as inconvenient as possible. They were so flat and shallow that trying to bring a giant Navy destroyer to shore was like trying to parallel park a cruise ship in a bathtub. The destroyers couldn't get within a mile of the soldiers, who would have to wait out forever, making them the easiest targets imaginable. So, how do you rescue an entire army from a shallow beach while it's being used for target practice? The answer wasn't some 4D chess masterstroke from the Royal Navy. It was a series of desperate phone calls. On May 27th, the government started frantically calling every boatyard they could find, basically cold calling owners like a desperate telemarketer with a once-in-a-lifetime offer. Can we borrow your boat for a quick trip to hell? And the fleet they assembled was something. Around 850 private boats were gathered. Fishing trawlers that still smelled of last week's catch, fancy yachts commandeered from rich guys who were definitely not getting their security deposit back, and little weekend cruisers. The government just straight up took most of them. Others were sailed by their actual owners, fishermen, dentists, accountants, who insisted on driving their own boats into a literal war zone. These weren't warships. Some of these things probably had a live, laugh, love sign hanging in the cabin. This weird, random floating garage sale was about to become the Army's only hope.
Section 3. The Voyage into Hell. This wasn't a booze cruise. It was a one-way ticket to the upside down. For these regular dudes, whose biggest naval concern was usually a rogue seagull stealing their sandwich, the 50-mile crossing was pure, uncut chaos. They were being hunted by planes from above and lurking dangers from below. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, owned the skies. Their planes were everywhere, like seagulls at a fish and chip stand. Only these ones dropped bombs. The scariest part was the screaming siren of the Stuka dive bomber, which became the official soundtrack of the mission. Imagine hearing that sound while you're in what is essentially a floating piece of wood powered by a lawnmower engine. You can't outrun it. You can't hide. Your only options were get lucky or get vaporized. And the ocean itself was a deadly game of Frogger. They had to dodge minefields and the jagged wreckage of other sunken ships. The water was coated in a thick black oil that made everything greasy and disgusting. But the most horrifying part? The bodies. They were floating everywhere. These amateur crews, in their little pleasure boats, had to literally steer around them. For these guys, with barely any gear and no real instructions, this entire trip was a waking nightmare. Section 4. The Nightmare on the Beach. If you thought the trip over was bad, what was waiting for them at Dunkirk was 100 times worse. One rescuer said, "With shells bursting and fires raging, it was like hell." The whole city was on fire, belching a giant cloud of black smoke that blocked out the sun, which was probably for the best, because nobody wanted to see this in high definition. As the little ships got closer, they saw it. The beach was literally black with people. An estimated 400,000 soldiers. A survivor said he just saw lines of men wearily and sleepily staggering across the beach. To maintain some kind of order, the soldiers formed queues that snaked from the sand dunes all the way out into the waves. Men stood for days in shoulder-deep water, exhausted, starving, and defeated. It was the world's most depressing, high-stakes water park line. The German bombs and artillery never stopped. The constant explosions were like being caught in a deadly thunderstorm where every lightning strike hits the ground right next to you. The little ship crews watched men get killed right in front of them, while they were just waiting patiently in line. They saw soldiers drive trucks and ambulances straight into the surf to make makeshift piers, because when things get this bad, your vehicle's warranty is pretty much void anyway. These civilian sailors had signed up for a rescue mission. They had arrived in a slaughterhouse. Section 5. A Glimmer of Hope, a Heavy Price. The work was certifiably insane. The task of rescuing that many men was like trying to empty an Olympic swimming pool with a teacup during an earthquake. The little ships became the world's most dangerous, worst-rated Uber service. They'd drive up to the beach, soldiers would swim or wade out, they'd fill the boat until it was practically sinking, and then they'd ferry them out to a big Navy ship waiting in deeper water. It was the worst Uber pool in history. 0 stars. Would not recommend. They worked 24/7 under constant fire. One lifeboat, the Prudential, ferried 800 men on its first night alone. Its crew worked for 30 hours straight. But this miracle came with a hefty receipt. People talk about the heroism, but they forget the losses. During the 9 days of the rescue, over 200 ships were sunk, including about 100 of the little ships that never came back. And the human cost was just as bad. At least 126 civilian sailors, the regular guys driving these boats, were killed. Countless more were wounded. These were volunteers who faced a modern army in boats designed for a picnic. For those who survived, the trauma was unreal. Doctors reported that rescuers and soldiers had what we now call PTSD, with crippling anxiety and nightmares. One survivor who watched a ship full of people sink couldn't be in a crowded room for the rest of his life. The Dunkirk story isn't just a victory lap. It's a story of incredible sacrifice and sheer bloody-minded courage. What part of this story is the most insane to you? Let us know in the comments. And if you think these untold stories need to be heard, do us a favor and smash that subscribe button and share this video. Section 6. The Hidden Truths and Lingering Trauma. The story of Dunkirk was immediately spun into a legend about the stiff upper lip Dunkirk spirit. And that was great for morale, but it papered over some wild truths. The little ships were absolute legends, but the idea that they single-handedly saved the whole army isn't totally right. Plot twist! The majority of soldiers, over two-thirds of them, about 239,000 men, were actually evacuated from a giant stone pier by the big Royal Navy destroyers. The little ships were the essential shuttle buses, the heroes who rescued the 100,000 guys stuck on the beaches where the big ships couldn't go, bringing them to the main transport. They were clutch, but the Navy was the real MVP of the operation. And yeah, about that miracle label. It really depended on where you were in line. For every 7 soldiers who escaped, 1 was killed or left behind as a prisoner of war. We're talking 40,000 British soldiers captured. Whew. And for the French soldiers who fought a heroic rearguard action to protect the escape route, it was even worse. Tens of thousands of them were captured when the last boats left. For them, Dunkirk wasn't a rescue. It was the beginning of 5 years in a prison camp. Today, the surviving little ships are basically historical artifacts. They sit in harbors, all polished and peaceful, looking like they wouldn't hurt a fly. But they tell 2 different stories. One is about the unbelievable courage of normal people doing insane things. But the other is a reminder of the true cost. A reminder that under the epic legend of the miracle is the untold horror of what those crews actually saw. A burning city and the terrifying reality of sailing a party boat straight into hell.